Hey, how you doing? Today I'm going to give a preview and predictions of the 2017 NCAA Women's Division One Lacrosse Tournament. It's been a fun season so far of lacrosse, and I'm definitely excited for this year's tournament. North Carolina, the University of North Carolina, is the defending champion, and they're in this field. They're seeded second. Um, so I have my notes and predictions right here. So I'm just going to get right to it. Before I get to my predictions, I just wanted to explain some things about the lacrosse tournament. This won't take long, and then I'll get right to the preview and prediction. So, just as a background, if you either are familiar with college lacrosse or you're not, this is just a little background information. There's 112 Division One lacrosse teams, so there's still not as many as most of the other sports, but of course it continues to grow as it has been. Um, in terms of the tournament itself, there's only 26 teams, women lacrosse teams that make the that wind up making the tournament. So that's really not that many, even though there are less teams that actually are playing lacrosse. Um, if of course if you're familiar with the basketball tournaments, the NCAA basketball tournaments, or even with some of the other sports, you're familiar with the field of 64, where so you have four regions of 16 teams, 32 on one side, 32 on the other, and then each region has a champion, the regional champion that advances to the final four. Then you have your final four where the regional champions play each other, and then you have your national championship game. Um, so it's actually a somewhat similar concept for the lacrosse tournament. It's single elimination, and of course, instead of the 64 teams, as I mentioned, it's the 26. The way to think about it, so if you picture in your head the basketball tournament, and then lower that down to 32 teams, but then take out 6 teams because this tournament it only seeds 8 teams, so there's 8 seeds. The top 6 seeds get a bye into the second round, so that's really important to note. So in other words, think of you have 16 teams at the top, 16 teams at the bottom, but 6 of those teams move on straight to the second round. So that's where you get your 26. And then your so yeah, and then this year the final four, the semifinals will be in Boston. I I believe where the I think it's where the Patriots play, although I'm not positive. Maybe the men's is where they play. I know last year it was in Philadelphia and it was at 2 different sites. So I'm actually not 100% positive about that. In terms of TV coverage, I know the Final Four should be on TV, but it'll definitely be streaming online. If not, the final will be on TV. In terms of the early rounds, I'm not 100% sure. I'm hoping some of them will be on either like ESPNU or one of the conference channels. If not, at least hopefully they'll stream some of them online. Really, I wish there was better TV coverage for the lacrosse. Hopefully, they're working on that a little bit. And then one last thing to mention is in terms of locations where the games are being played. As I mentioned, the Final Four national championship games will be in Boston. All rounds leading up to that are at campus sites, and it sort of works out that it's at the highest seed within that little grouping of teams. So it's kind of hard to explain if you're not looking at the bracket, but yeah, it's at a campus. So it's not really a neutral site. Some of the games are a neutral site if that team isn't playing, but then when they are playing, it is a neutral site. So, for example, North Carolina there will be games played in North Carolina. So when North Carolina is not playing, it's the 2 teams that are playing to play North Carolina. Then it is a neutral site, but then in the next round it's not. So technically it is though a neutral site. It's not a home game for the team, even though it is their home stadium or whatever. Okay, so now on to the actual tournament. I didn't want to focus too much on the teams that didn't make it. There are a lot of good teams that didn't make it, largely because there's only those 26 teams that do make it. Um, the one team I did want to mention that didn't make it was Denver. Um, I thought it was a little strange that they didn't make it. Their final record was 14-4, but two of those losses were to Florida, who's a really good team. And then one of the losses was at Georgetown. Um, Georgetown had a pretty good team. They didn't make the tournament, but consider that for Georgetown, that's a far away game. I know a lot of these teams in lacrosse do have those type of away games. But I thought it was a little odd that Denver didn't make it, but I did want to mention that. And there were a few others, bubble teams, that I could mention, but I do want to get onto the predictions. So here are the official predictions. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through each game, and I'm going to get to the Final Four, then I'm going to stop, and then I'll do the Final Four all together. So it'll make sense as I go along. So the number one seed is Maryland. Maryland comes into this tournament undefeated. Traditionally one of the best teams in the country. They did lose in the final to UNC last year. So they are the number one seed, and they are going to play the winner of Towson and High Point. Towson and High Point are two interesting teams. Towson, of course, is a Maryland team, so if they win, that would be an interesting matchup there. Although I do like High Point, I'm going to pick Towson in this game. They've played a nice schedule. I think that they'll be motivated at the chance to play Maryland, and so yeah, I have Towson in that game. Then moving on, I have Maryland versus Towson. I have Maryland in that game. So as I mentioned, Maryland is undefeated. They're playing really well. They'll be playing a home game there. I think it's interesting because they lost a pretty good senior class, including Taylor Cummings, who was obviously a really good player. But they've had some close games this year, but they've been really playing well. And I think that would be a tough game against Towson, but I have them advancing to the quarterfinals there. So moving down the bracket, Northwestern versus Albany. This is a really interesting game because Northwestern is a team that received an at-large bid from the Big Ten. Their record was only 10-9, which is not great, but a lot of those losses are close games to good teams. Albany is a team I really like. I think this has the potential to be a good game. I am going to go with Northwestern. I struggle with this game a little bit because I didn't want to pick against Albany, but I do like Northwestern. I think that they've been challenged a lot in their regular season, so I'm going to go with them. Then underneath that game, the 8 seed is Stony Brook. Stony Brook comes into this tournament with an 18-1 record. I really like the Stony Brook team. They have not played the toughest schedule. They do have wins over a good amount of teams that are in the tournament, though. And one thing I really like about this Stony Brook team is they've just found ways to win a lot of games. Their only loss is to Florida. That was a game that was at Florida. And no matter what schedule a team has, I always just love teams that win when it comes to tournament time. I know some people might question their schedule a little bit, but they come in as 8 seed here, and I'm going to have them defeating Bryant in that game. So the second round game I have would be Northwestern versus Stony Brook, and I'm going to go with Stony Brook again in that game. So that would set up a really interesting quarterfinal between the 1 seed Maryland and the 8 seed Stony Brook. And in that game, I think it would be a really fun game, but I am going to pick Maryland in that game. So I'm going to have Maryland advancing to the semifinal, the Final Four, with a win over Stony Brook in the quarterfinals. So then lowering down a little bit, the next seed here is the 5th seed Princeton. Princeton is a really interesting team. They won the Ivy League, which was a really good conference in women's lacrosse this year. Two of their losses were to Penn State and Maryland. They did lose to Penn in the regular season, but they came back to beat them in the Ivy League tournament. So that's how they earned the 5th seed here. They play the winner of Cornell and Notre Dame. Um, Cornell, another Ivy League team, and Notre Dame coming out of the ACC. I'm going to pick Cornell in that game because, again, as I mentioned, I'm really high on these Ivy League teams this year. And I think that Cornell is going to be ready to play in that game. So then in the second round, I'm gonna I have Princeton versus Cornell. This would be very interesting. The third time this year that these teams would have met. Princeton did win both times in the regular season. One of them coming in the conference tournament final. But I do. I should say that they were very, very close games. In fact, one of them went to double overtime. So this would be. I wouldn't count out Notre Dame against Cornell, but if it is Princeton versus Cornell, which is what I have here, I'm going to go with Princeton to advance to the quarterfinals. So that I have the 5th seed, Princeton, and what would be their third time just this year playing Cornell. I have them advancing to the quarterfinals. Then lowering a little bit down, the first round game is James Madison versus Louisville. Two interesting teams. Louisville's another one of these ACC teams, so they're going to be battle tested. They're not going to. There's not much they haven't seen. Look at all these ACC teams that made the tournament. James Madison is a really, really interesting team coming out of the state of Virginia. They're another team, although they're not in a power conference, so to speak. They have played a really solid schedule, and a lot of the games against some of the top teams they've played close. So I'm going to have James Madison advancing over Louisville here, and whoever wins this game advances to play the 4th seed Penn State, who earned at-large bid out of the Big Ten. Penn State had a really good year, going 15-3. They had some nice wins. They lost in the semifinals of the Big Ten tournament to Northwestern. They played Maryland pretty close. Probably gave Maryland one of their toughest games, and I'm sure they'd love that rematch in the semifinals. So I'm going to have Penn State versus James Madison in the second round here, and I'm going to have Penn State advancing to the quarterfinals where they would take on Princeton. So then in the quarterfinal round, it would be Penn State versus Princeton, the 4 seed Penn State versus 5 seed Princeton. This would be a rematch of a game played earlier this year that was won by Penn State, a close game. In this round, I'm going to have Penn State advancing to the semifinals, to the Final Four over Princeton here. So that would set up Maryland versus Penn State in the Final Four. And that would be another rematch of a game. So I'm going to come back to that game in a moment once I do the bottom side of the bracket. So the 3rd seed is Florida. Really good team, only 2 losses. Actually, those 2 losses were to Maryland and North Carolina. So very tough team here. They are awaiting the winner of USC, Southern California USC versus Jacksonville. I'm going to go with USC in that game. I really like this USC team. So I'm going to have them advancing. Florida would have to be ready for USC in the second round there. That'll be a tough game. I'm going to go with Florida advancing over USC, but they need to be ready for USC in that game for sure. Below that is Boston College versus Canisius. I'm going to go with Boston College here, another one of those ACC teams, and they'd advance to play the 6th seed Syracuse. In that game, I'm going to go with Syracuse. Just a solid team there, the Orange. So then that would set up a quarterfinal between the 3rd seed Florida versus the 6th seed Syracuse, and in that game I have Florida advancing. So I have Florida advancing to the semifinals, so that's your 3rd Final Four participant there. going down a little bit more, the 7 seed Penn, they are, even though they're 7 seed, they are playing a first round game because only the top 6 seeds get that bye. So I have the 7 seed Penn, or they're playing Navy in the first round, which is an interesting game. Navy's a tough team for sure, but I do have Penn advancing here. Below that, Colorado versus UMass. This is going to be a really tough game. Two really good teams. Colorado had an awesome year. I'm going to have Colorado winning that game. UMass is a tough team. I didn't want to pick against them, but I love this Colorado team. So I'm going to have Colorado versus Penn. And in a little bit of an upset here, I'm going to go with Colorado to advance to the quarterfinals. So moving down a little bit, we have Virginia versus Elon. Elon's a really interesting team. One of these sort of smaller school teams that aren't necessarily powerhouse, but they do have a very solid team. But I'm going to go with Virginia in this game. So then Virginia would advance to play the 2nd seed North Carolina, the defending champion. Two teams that, of course, know each other really well. But in that game, I'm going to go with North Carolina, the 2nd seed, to advance to the quarterfinals, where they, according to me, would meet Colorado. And in that game, I'm going to take North Carolina. I just think the defending champion Tar Heels, I think they'd have enough over a really tough Colorado team here to advance to the Final Four. So that's my Final Four. The 1 seed Maryland versus the 4 seed Penn State at the top of the bracket. Bottom of the bracket, I have the 3rd seed Florida against the 2nd seed North Carolina Tar Heels. So in the top of the bracket here, I was very, very tempted to take Penn State over Maryland because they're so familiar with them. Penn State has a ton of talent on their team. They're well coached, really solid team. But in the end, I went with Maryland. They're the only undefeated team in college lacrosse right now. I just don't see, I think it would be very difficult for them not to advance to the national championship game. They just have so much talent all over the field, and they're playing really, really well. In the bottom semifinal, but look out for Penn State. That's a really, really good Penn State team, and if this is the matchup, Penn State, trust me, would give Maryland a very, very tough game. Bottom of the bracket here, I have 3rd seed Florida versus the 2nd seed and defending champion North Carolina. I'm going to go with Florida here in what maybe is a slight upset. This would be a rematch of a game that much earlier in the year was won by North Carolina. But I think Florida is playing really good lacrosse right now. They have such an interesting mix of players in terms of geography. Florida, isn't, in terms of the state of Florida, isn't necessarily a lacrosse hotbed, so to speak. Although hopefully it is growing. And but I just love this Florida team. They're playing really good lacrosse, like I said. Their only 2 losses were to Maryland and North Carolina, and they played a tough schedule, so you cannot knock them at all for that. So my national championship game I'm going to have, which will be played on May 28th, which I believe is the Sunday before Memorial Day. Although I'd have to double check that, but I think that's right. I have the number 1 seeded Maryland Terrapins versus the number 3 seeded Florida Gators. This would be another rematch of a game that was won by Maryland early in the year. Maryland comes into the tournament 19-0. Very good team. As I've mentioned a few times, Florida comes in at 17-2. The Big East Conference champions. And in this game, I'm going to go with Florida to win the national championship. As I mentioned, I really like this Florida team. I think they're playing really good. They would have a really tough game potentially in the second round against USC, but if they get through that game, I would like them against Syracuse, as I mentioned. And then, of course, in the semifinal, if it's UNC, that'd be a tough game. Potentially, it could be Colorado or Penn. Potentially, UVA sneaks in there. We'll see. But I love this Florida team. Could you imagine that if in the semifinal they beat UNC and then the national championship beat Florida? That'd be quite a run there. That's what I'm going for. So thank you for watching this video. If you get a chance, go out and see some of these games or watch them on TV, as hopefully a lot of them will be televised or at the very least streaming online. So thanks again for watching and enjoy the tournament. It should be really entertaining.